Nearly every example of strict gun control laws working seem to come from one part of the world. I examine why in this episode of the Mayoral Podcast. Welcome back, everyone. So why do some of these countries seem to have working gun control policies, strict gun control policies? Because if you look at the relative number of firearm deaths versus the relative freedoms that these countries enjoys, it seems to be working. Now, nearly all these examples that you'll find when people are making this argument that we need to, here in the United States, be more like country A or country B, almost all those examples will be in Europe. So I'm primarily going to focus on why it seems to be working in these European countries, and if it's something that we could actually implement here in America. But why do the countries that have these strict gun control laws maintain relative high levels of freedom? So I really want to break this down into two parts. And the first part is going to be kind of the lead up to World War II and World War II itself. And the second part is going to be the years following World War II. So the first part that I want to examine is the past when it comes to the lead up to World War II. And people use examples of countries that have strict gun control laws as a blueprint for the United States. So I really want to look at the events before World War II because I feel like World War II kind of ends up being a reset of that argument. So the 5 years leading up to World War II, just looking at military spending, Germany was the highest country in terms of total military spending, kind of followed in second and third, depending on the year that you're looking at and the statistics you're looking at. You'll have the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. And then fourth and fifth is going to fall to Japan and the United States. And then sixth and seventh will be France and Italy. So during that time, it was typical for about a 7 to 8 to 1 spend from Germany over France. At its peak, it was kind of like close to 10 to 1. But the reason I'm calling this particular country out in France is that during World War II, it was invaded by Germany and in short order was overthrown. It took about 6 weeks for Germany to overtake the entire country of France. And again, looking at their military spend, they were consistently in the top 10, usually about 6th or 7th leading up to World War II, and they just got absolutely steamrolled by a far superior country in terms of military prowess. So, I think it's important when talking about specific countries in post World War II, kind of looking at the landscape of Europe after World War II, and what kind of strict gun laws were implemented that are seemingly working in these countries. World War II, I think, to me, serves as an example of when countries cannot defend itself, what could potentially happen to it when it runs into a vastly superior, very aggressive country. And I think one of the things that I'm going to look at here is the map of Europe during World War II. So basically, during World War II in 1942, the majority of mainland Europe was under control of either Nazi Germany or the Italians, Mussolini's Italy. And if you look at the map, the only countries in mainland Europe that were not run by the power of access was Sweden, Spain, Switzerland, Portugal, and Turkey. Now, Turkey is primarily in Asia, but it's still a Eurasian country, and even now today is part of NATO. But those were 5 countries that prior to the war declared neutrality and remain neutral throughout the entire war. So you might see people talk about something like a country like Sweden and say, okay, well, we could go even further back than World War II. I would argue against that, specifically because I think it was just a matter of time before Nazi Germany would have taken Sweden over. If you look at some of the other neutral countries, I'm going to read this here, is Denmark, Belgium, Norway, Luxembourg, and Netherlands had all established policies of neutrality prior to the start of the war, yet Germany ignored those intentions and invaded all 5 countries in April of 1940. Again, World War II started in September of 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, and by 6 months later, they were already ignoring these declarations of neutrality from a lot of these other countries. They even invaded the Soviet Union, which I think was probably their individual biggest mistake, is that they decided that they were going to invade the Soviet Union. And again, Soviet Union had signed prior to World War II, them and Nazi Germany had signed a non-aggression pact. So they were essentially not necessarily allies, but they were agreeing that they weren't going to go after each other. And Hitler totally ignored that. So if you're looking at some of those countries that remained neutral throughout World War II, I think that they were more lucky than anything else. It was just a matter of time before Nazi Germany would have taken over those countries and totally, completely ignored their neutrality. So World War II is one of many examples where a relatively feeble country just gets upended by a more powerful country. In a lot of cases, these countries that take over these relatively weak countries ends up being more authoritarian. So I guess you have to ask yourself in that situation, would you rather be the former or the latter? And I think the answer is you'd rather be the former until the latter takes over. So these always end up being just a matter of time before either the country decides to pick itself up off the mat and defend itself by investing more in military, and with more power comes the quest for having even greater power, or they eventually get overrun by another country. It really happens like throughout history, and has happened throughout all of recorded history, and will continue to happen. So the fact that we're living in, I guess, relatively peaceful times, post World War II, when it comes to especially mainland Europe, it's really only a matter of time. But regardless of what the gun laws were in these individual countries in the lead up to World War II, overall their defenses did not work. Countries in Europe that had strict gun laws or weak gun laws, they all fell to the eventual fascist rule of Italy and Germany, who had extremely strict gun laws that didn't allow their citizens to defend themselves. And that in and of itself is taking away the check and balance on the system. There's no way for citizens to kind of rise up and overcome really whatever these regimes kind of put on the people, and whatever their political viewpoints are. That really gets forced on the people, because the people really have no action recourse. Not that they need to have not that they need to actually exercise that, but the fact that they would even have the opportunity to do it if they were able to defend themselves and keep arms would in itself be a check against the system. So the one country that really didn't fall was Great Britain. Now, they're not part of mainland Europe, and they were one of the world powers at the time, certainly. But I think it's important to note, when it comes to their gun laws didn't really get strict until post-World War II. So when we're talking about the example of, Great Britain has pretty strict gun laws, it's not the same as it was back before World War II, when they were kind of the world power going into World War II. So I'm going to shift a little bit to post-Cold War, but I'm going to touch on just a couple of points of the Cold War before I hop into that. First is, the start of the Cold War basically happened right after the conclusion of World War II. NATO was formed shortly after that. It was formed in 1949, really to kind of fight communism. Everyone that was part of the NATO treaty was, pro-democracy and anti-communism, and that was kind of the agreement there. Shortly after that, I believe it was 1953, 1955, somewhere in that neighborhood, the Warsaw Pact was signed. It was kind of in opposition to NATO. So you've seen some of the eastern countries that weren't part of NATO, Eastern European countries that is, join up with the Soviet Union in an alliance to really kind of combat the power of NATO. That brings us to the post-Cold War and really kind of today's time. So, I think you need to look at what the current military forces are around the world to kind of compare to, what happened in World War II, the last, major conflict in the continent of Europe. So current military forces, and this is according to Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and this is for the year 2021. So I'm going to look at some of the Nordic countries. These are the ones that I think in a lot of cases people use as the example of what we need to do in terms of structuring either whether it's social programs or gun control laws. So I'm going to look at Norway, Sweden, and Finland. They spent $8.3 billion, and that ranked 30th for Norway in 2021. Sweden was 7.9, 32nd, and this is in the world. And then Finland, 5.9 billion, and that ranked 37th in the world. So you look at world powers today, and the number one spender in 2021 is clearly going to be the United States. We spent $801 billion. So now remember, Germany in the lead up to World War II at most outspent France 10-1. And they took over France in the matter of 6 weeks. So this is 100-1. U.S. spending 100-1 compared to these Nordic countries. And I think that the comparison, or the point I'm trying to make here, is that realistically, these countries could not defend themselves against the United States. Now they are, politically aligned, and Norway is part of NATO, but that doesn't mean that, things couldn't change somewhere down the line. My point is that simply they wouldn't be able to defend themselves against a power like the United States. China ranks second in that list in 2021 of an estimated 293 billion. India at 77 billion, United Kingdom at 68 billion, and then Russia ranked fifth in the world with $66 billion in spending. Now, that brings us kind of to the major conflict that we have in Europe today, which is not involving any NATO countries. It's between Russia and Ukraine. In 2021, Ukraine spent just under $6 billion on their military, which was $5.9 billion. So that ranked 35th in the world, 34th in the world, and they were 11-1 is what they were outspent by Russia. So the comparison that I'm trying to make is obviously that the less you spend, the more likely you are to just get quickly overthrown. That's what happened in World War II. That's not happening in this case. So you ask yourself, why is Ukraine holding their own? Or how are they holding their own against Russia? And it's really quite simple. So I'm gonna reference an article here from the BBC. It's from February 21st of 2023. How much money has the U.S. given to Ukraine? So U.S. President Joe Biden announced nearly $500 million more of U.S. military aid to Ukraine during a surprise visit to Kyiv this week. That's on top of the billions the United States has already sent to Ukraine's conflict with Russia. Congress appropriated more than $112 billion in 2022 alone. So $112 billion versus the $66 billion that Russia spent. That in and of itself, just the funding from the United States, is almost double what they were able to, what Russia was able to spend the prior year. So essentially, we're fighting a proxy war over there by funding Ukraine. So I don't think anyone disagrees that Russia is the wrong country here. They're on the wrong side of history. Ukraine is simply defending their land. But the reason that they're in this, and the reason that they have survived the way that they have, is not only because of the brave fighting of the citizens that they have there and their military, but it really is because the United States is funding that war. Make no mistake about that. If it weren't for the United States, they would have fallen already. So you look at, since the invasion of Ukraine, you look at some of these other countries, these near NATO countries, these Sweden and Finland's politically, typically aligned with the West. They're not official members of NATO. I think that they've certainly enjoyed the freedoms and the security that NATO has provided them over the years, just being in that close proximity. But they're trying to now join NATO. And I mean, really, you can't blame them for trying to join NATO. Now, I think if anything were to happen, if Russia were to invade Finland or Sweden, you would certainly see the United States and a lot of the other nations step in to help out and provide them aid, even though they're not obligated to. But if you were in their situation, if you're Finland or Sweden, wouldn't you rather be part of NATO and not end up like Ukraine, which is, in a lot of parts in rubble now because of the invasion from Russia? I'm going to read a quick part from this Bloomberg article talking about Finland's new membership into NATO, or the soon-to-be membership into NATO. So, Hungary ratifies Finland's NATO bid, leaving Sweden behind. Hungary backed Finland's ascension to NATO, ending months of foot-dragging by Prime Minister Viktor Orban and leaving the Nordic country one step away from joining the defensive alliance. While it backed Finland, Hungary kept Sweden's application on ice in a dispute that Orban's party has links to a clash inside the European Union over the rule of law. So you're now seeing Finland is going to be joining NATO. And Finland, if you're not familiar with the map of Europe, Finland shares about as big a border as any other country with Russia. So it might be, I can't really tell, it's not a straight line, but it looks like it's bigger than the border with Ukraine. So Finland joining would essentially leave, if they leave Sweden off, would leave Sweden kind of in no man's land. But I mean, realistically, they would be surrounded by Norway and Finland, the only two countries that they border. They have the Baltic Sea in between them and a bunch of other NATO countries. To me, they would be similar to Switzerland and can just be a neutral country and enjoy the benefits of the protection of NATO, as long as they don't get aggressive with anyone around them, which why would they? They would have no shot to take on really any of those countries, let alone the United States when they'd have to be stepping in if they were to attack. So I don't know what Sweden's going to do from here. Maybe they continue to get the bid from NATO, but ultimately it's not going to really matter with Finland. Now bordering or that does border Russia, and now being able to join NATO. I mean, Russia would have to fire missiles over Finland just to hit Sweden. So I mean, they're pretty well insulated from that. I think that one might even be considered an act of war if you're firing missiles over NATO airspace, even if it's not aimed at a NATO country. I would assume that would potentially count as an act of war. So I think Sweden will be pretty well insulated. We'll see what they do. I'm simply pointing out that with Finland's new entrance into NATO, Sweden will likely end up having the protections of NATO, even if they join or not. So again, how are these countries doing it? I think it's become pretty obvious, but how do they have these strict gun laws and refrain from slipping into some type of a totalitarian state? So there's really two ways to kind of break this down. There's a pretty simple answer that would explain exactly what's happening and what's going to potentially happen, and the other one is I think what is really happening at this moment in time, and why we're not seeing any of these countries fall into any type of authoritarian type of rule. So the simple answer is just give it time. The reason I started talking about World War II at the beginning of this episode is because using these countries as an example of what the United States should do really holds water when you get post-World War II. Because prior to World War II, regardless of what their gun laws were, it didn't work. They just got run over by, for the most part, Hitler and Mussolini, and really, fell into the prey category. So they didn't have the protection to even defend themselves. And whatever their gun laws were, it didn't work. So my basic intention is that if you have strict gun laws and a very powerful country, the power is only going to lead to the quest for more power from those individuals or from that regime, which is ultimately going to lead to the oppression of the people from that country. My other contention is that if your country is not powerful enough to be on the world stage, it's probably not powerful enough to really truly defend itself against any major threat. So even if you have strict gun laws and you're seeing your citizens, enjoy the freedom of the protection that your government provides you without being authoritarian, it's really only going to be a matter of time before another country comes along and takes your freedoms away from you. Have Europeans actually figured out the right formula of socialist programs and disarming their citizens with not falling into authoritarianism? Or is it possible that there's a stronger country out there that has their citizens armed as a check against their own power that is protecting all their freedoms? Why haven't any other non-NATO or non-NATO adjacent countries figured this out? Is Europe for some reason special? Is Asia, Africa, and South America not special? These countries that are used as examples of what we should do with our laws in terms of gun control and social spending programs haven't figured out anything other than they are able to outsource their safety and security to the United States as long as the United States stays as the world power. And not to get too far off topic, but these social programs that they tout in these European countries don't really work that well. Healthcare, for example, the quality of healthcare in these countries is not very good to the average citizen. Now, if you're rich, you can afford better healthcare, but you're not really part of that system. And those who have actually experienced the waiting times for a lot of simple things like checkups and simple procedures would be people that you want to talk to that can actually illuminate the issues with the social programs. Another thing that is not factored in is the fact that they are not spending anywhere near as much on their military because, again, they don't have to. They've basically outsourced their security to the United States. So if you take a look at some of these countries and you look at their military spending, and as a percentage of GDP, the United States in 2021 spent 3.5% of its GDP on the military. You compare that to some of these other countries that are frequently referred to as the countries that we should base either our social programs or gun control laws off of. In Norway, you got 1.8% of GDP. Sweden is 1.3%. You got Finland at 2%. And then Switzerland, which is not a Nordic country, but it's the neutral country out there, they spend 0.7% of their GDP on military. Because again, they don't have to defend themselves. So these countries do have a relative good amount of freedom. But that freedom is depending on the very freedom that they gave up and outsourced to their government, which is the right to defend themselves. Now, their governments are really banking on the fact that the United States is the world power and will remain the world power. These countries cannot defend themselves, but the United States is defending them and has been defending them and will continue to defend them so long as they are the world power. Now, they've been living the last 75 years essentially under a stars and stripes dome in Europe. It's been extreme levels of peace that has never been seen before. If you look at some of the conflicts, I'm looking at the conflicts of the 21st century, and there are no NATO countries in there. You look at the list, and they have Georgia, some in Kosovo, some more in Georgia. There's one in Macedonia, but that was from 2001. That was before they joined NATO. And then everything else is Russia. There's some Ukraine in there. Every single one of the conflicts that have happened in Europe over the last 20 years, none of them have involved any NATO countries. If you go back to the formation of NATO, there was little to no conflicts in any of the NATO countries since its formation. So Europeans and Americans that are making the argument that arming citizens is unnecessary cannot seem to make the connection that the United States has really provided that freedom for Europe since World War II, essentially outsourcing all safety and security to the government. The citizens have done that in those countries, but those governments have outsourced their safety and security to the United States. They can't seem to make that connection. The United States citizens being armed is the check and balance against a potential authoritarian regime in the United States. And as the United States protects all of Europe, they are dependent on that same system too, whether they realize it or not. The United States needs to continue to be the beacon of freedom. The ability to allow their citizens to defend themselves is really what's providing the defense for the people in those other countries from falling into authoritarian regimes and from attack from other foreign nations. I alluded to it before. Maybe the current regime that's trying to take away the gun rights of citizens, the right to defend themselves, is not in pursuit of absolute power, but it always ends up being a matter of time. The next regime might not be the same. In 1917, the people of Russia overthrew the government. In 1918, Vladimir Lenin took away the rights of the citizens to defend themselves. The people of Russia fought a civil war that continued through 1923. Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, shortly after they got Joseph Stalin in power. Stalin is credited with killing over 40 million people. His reign ran from 1929 to 1953. That's not that long ago. 1953 is 70 years ago. We're not even talking a full lifetime, a full life expectancy in the United States of America. So he was able to kill 40 million people. And you look at some of these people that are making arguments of not only banning assault weapons, but banning all guns because of murders that occur in the United States. According to the CDC, 17,730 people per year died due to gun homicide, and that's from 2018 to 2021. So basically, it would take a country like the United States of 335 million gun-wielding citizens more than 2,200 years to kill as many people with guns as Joseph Stalin did in about 25. And that's coming less than a dozen years after his country had disarmed its own citizens. I go back to my simple explanation as to why this is actually seeming to work for these countries, specifically the ones in Europe with these strict gun control laws. It's only a matter of time. It was only a matter of time before it happened to Russia. It's only a matter of time for all these other countries. Now, right now, it doesn't seem like that because of the United States being the protector of these freedoms for these countries. And as long as the United States remains the same, it will continue to protect the freedoms for those citizens. So no, Europe has not figured out the right balance to disarm citizens and not fall into tyrannical rule. What they have figured out is that the price to protect those citizens can be outsourced to the United States. And as long as the United States stands as their protector, they can continue to enjoy the freedoms that America provides them. That's it for this episode of the Mayoral Podcast. Please make sure that you hit the like, subscribe, and follow button, and I will see you in the next episode.